To build Blueprinter, we are going to use the MVP pattern. This stands for Model View Presenter. And if you're familiar with MVC, Model View Controller, then you're going to see some similarities and differences between these two patterns. The primary difference is that every view has a presenter, and you can think of a presenter as a highly specialized controller. It's a controller for a specific view. There are primarily two variants of MVP. One is called supervising controller, the other is called passive view. We are going to look at these two variants in this lesson, and then we will look at how we can communicate between the view and the presenter in the next lesson. I've already created two projects, and right now they are identical, but one is called supervising controller, the other is called passive view, and they each have this simple form. It has two text boxes and an OK button. Now in this lesson we're not going to do anything with the OK button, but we're going to modify these two forms to implement the supervising controller and the passive view patterns. We're going to start with passive view, because as far as the view is concerned, this is the most simple. And the first thing we need is an interface, because when the presenter communicates with the view, we don't want to use the form object itself. We want to do so through an interface. So let's add an interface to the project. Right-click on the project, go to Add. I'm going to go to New Item and choose Interface. Since this is the Manage Person form, I'm going to call this Manage Person form. Although whenever we write Blueprinter, we're going to use the term view instead of form. But since I already called this form, I'm going to call this interface Manage Person form. Now the idea behind passive view is that the view itself is dumb. There is practically no logic whatsoever inside of the view. Everything is done inside of the presenter. So if we want to set a value for the first name text box or the last name text box, we need to expose properties to set those values. And we don't want those properties to be of type text box, because the presenter is supposed to be oblivious to the actual implementation of the view. The idea is, if we wanted to port this application to ASP.NET, we should be able to reuse the same presenter. All we would have to do is write a new view. So instead of a text box, we could have properties that are strings. And then whenever we implement those properties, we could get and set the values of the first name and last name text boxes. So let's go to our interface and let's add the definition for a first name property. We need that to get and set, and then the last name property. And we also want that to get and set. And then we can go to our Manage Person form class and implement this interface. And in the actual implementation for the getter of the first name property, we will return first name text box dot text. And then for the setter, we would set first name text box dot text to whatever value was supplied to the property. And we would do the same thing for last name. Although instead of first name text box, we want last name text box. Now we're not going to implement a presenter for this passive view because we are not going to use passive view for Blueprinter. The passive view pattern is wonderful for completely separating the view from everything else, and that makes the view a lot easier to test. But it also adds a lot of complexity to the presenter, because then not only does the presenter have to interface with the model and everything else within the domain, it also has to do very tedious work with the view. For example, I have a model class called person. So the presenter would interface with the data access layer in order to retrieve a person. So it would have this person object. And then in order to set the first name and the last name inside of our view, we would have to do view.firstname equals person.firstname. And then we would have to do the same thing for last name. View.lastname equals person.lastname. And that's not that big of a deal for this particular view, but if we have a form with a lot of controls that we have to manage, things can get a little hairy. So while there are some pros for the passive view, there are, of course, cons for the passive view. And personally, I think there are more cons than pros, so no passive view for us. The views are smarter in the supervising controller pattern. They know what to do with the information provided by the presenter. So once again, the presenter gets a person object. Well, it passes that person object onto the view, and then the view decides how it's going to display that person object. So once again, we need an interface. So let's add a new interface. And like in the other project, I'm going to call it iManagePersonForm because there's really no need for it to have another name. But instead of having first name and last name properties, it's simply going to have a person property. So we want to define a property of type person, and we will just call it person. And we can get and set. Let's implement this interface in our ManagePersonForm class. And for this property, we might want a backing field. So let's first of all implement the interface, and then we will add the backing field. So private person, and we will call it underscore person. We of course need to add the using statement for our model namespace. And once we do that, we can get rid of this model in front of person. Now the getter and the setter here are going to be more complex than they were with our passive view. But that's okay, because the view in supervising controller is supposed to know what to do with this information. So whenever we get the information, we are simply going to return a person. Now we should probably set the first name and last name properties on our person to whatever is in the text box. So we will say person.firstname equals firstname text box dot text, and then we will do the same thing for last name. Last name equals last name text box dot text, and then we will return that person. But whenever we set this property, we want to set our backing field to whatever was the value, and then we will set the value of the text boxes. So first name text box dot text equals person dot first name, and we want to do the same thing for the last name. So dot text equals underscore person dot last name. And so this simplifies our presenter. So for an example, we would have view.person equals person. And then that's it. So that's definitely a pro. A con is that the view is now more difficult to test. But for me personally, the pros outweigh the cons. In the next lesson, we're going to add a simple presenter to this project, so that you can see how we communicate between the presenter and the view.